Welcome to Empowering the Unseen, a speaker series where we focus on stories and perspectives that aren't typically considered in the public narrative around HIV and AIDS. My name is Marisa. I am an intern with Until There's a Cure, and I'm incredibly excited to have some conversations with individuals about their experiences and expertise in HIV and AIDS advocacy, prevention, treatment, and education. I know I'm excited to learn something new, and I hope you can too. Thanks for tuning in. So today I'm talking with Char'Lee King. She is an LGBTQ plus reproductive health specialist, an HIV activist, and a doula. I'm very excited to talk to her today. How are you, Char'Lee?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you to start off, what sort of drew you to specifically HIV activism and education of LGBTQ youth? What drew you to that and what got you started in that?
I didn't specifically get started in LGBTQ youth and like HIV
Mhm.
work. I think it was kind of it was like a journey. So I started off as a sex educator
Mhm.
in college, and then I went to work for an organization in Wisconsin where we did a lot of community engagement as it related to getting folks tested for HIV and other STIs. And I think that journey led me to really see that folks in my community weren't educated about how HIV was passed along or what resources were available to them if they were HIV positive. Um, and it was disheartening, especially because when I was in high school, I went through all this like sex education or I didn't have sex education in high school. I went to Catholic school.
Yeah, and I didn't either. I was also in a like Christian um leaning first high school, so we had abstinence only.
Yeah, so I actually was a part of the Boys and Girls Club that
Mhm.
gave me that education and like led me to do like a bunch of like public health work. Um,
Um,
so once I went to college, just I became a sex educator because I was already exposed to it through my work with the Boys and Girls
yeah.
Club. And then fast forward to my first job where I was trying to still put the pieces together and figure out why some communities had resources and access to the education and other communities didn't.
Mhm.
Um, and then it kind of led to my work working specifically with LGBTQ folks, especially um, Black and Brown LGBTQ folks, and now slowly focusing on Black women.
Like women, yes. And I did see I had read the Visible article that you had written on talking about where are the voices of Black women and girls in HIV awareness, and you had talked about some of the different blocks. As you just said, it kind of depends on the community. What do you think are the main blocks for Black women and queer people in those communities in terms of getting testing and education? What are those main ones to focus on?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of writing that article with my mentors, Randy Singer and Natasha Crooks. So I have to give them credit as well. It wasn't a solo venture, but I think some of the main barriers is the lack of knowledge, not only by community, but by healthcare professionals and the stigma. The HIV is still heavily stigmatized, right? So a lot of folks are still talking about HIV like it's only a gay disease, which we know is not true. HIV impacts and affects everyone. Um, and the way that folks talk about it also translate into people being afraid of or hesitant to go into a healthcare provider and say, "Hey, I need an HIV test," or "Hey, I need, I'm having sex with multiple partners, or I'm having sex with one person, but I just want to make sure that I'm protected." Can be intimidating, right? Um, I think in also in certain communities, access isn't there.
Mhm.
And when access is there, it is um, there's not enough capacity to care for everyone, right? and the quality of healthcare or the way that folks are being treated in those systems aren't necessarily the best. But because that's what they have access to, that's where people are like, oh, you should go, or it shouldn't matter, or you should do the things where that's not really respecting their bodily autonomy or their choice, right? And it's almost like, well, because we put this here, I don't know what you're complaining about because we met the need. And sometimes meeting the need isn't enough, if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense. So, not only just because it meets the need doesn't mean that the person is looked at holistically or feels safe in the situation.
Yeah, and if a provider isn't well versed in how to care for a patient holistically or doesn't have cultural competence,
Yeah,
it really impacts how a person view the healthcare system and whether or not they engage or disengage.
absolutely.
If a provider is prescribing um, medication that doesn't fit with folks' lifestyle, there will be less adherent to it. And there are assumptions that, well, I gave them, you know, I did my job is kind of what I see. I did my job. I gave them the medication. I gave them the education.
Mhm.
Now it's up to them, but there weren't questions or there wasn't like more probing to figure out what's the not even that's not say that. There weren't more questions or probing to figure out what options we can give people and then let people choose what option works best for them. If
Okay,
that makes
have autonomy and things that work with their life. And I guess also having an understanding, just not assuming where people's education is and understanding. Because yeah, I do think it is at least overall in the US seen as a gay male disease, and not something that people consider for women, or Black women specifically in the South. And I think yeah, the idea of cultural competence and understanding that some people might be coming in with that assumption and not knowing this is something that they need to consider in their options. So I know that you said just now that you went from sex educator and that kind of led you into looking at different groups and into HIV advocacy. Are there any, in terms of within groups themselves, are there any assumptions that people within groups, either Black women or young LGBTQ people, that they have about HIV treatment that you've come upon, that they just have assumptions about what they may or may not need and how to address those?
Can you clarify that question?
So I guess it goes back to the not having the education or sort of the perceived risk and sort of not understanding what the steps they need to take, or maybe if they should be on PrEP or something. Are there any specific assumptions that you've seen people come in with that you would want to clarify if you were talking to them or telling healthcare providers to think about?
So are you asking me about like the consumer or are we talking about providers?
The consumer, yes.
Um, I think and I think I'm struggling with this question because I think that's a weird way to,
Yes, I'm sorry.
and I say I think it's a weird way to say it because at the end of the day, people know what's best for their bodies and how they want to navigate their lives, right?
I see. Yes.
And I think where the system fails is that the system, even though they say we should treat folks individually, right? And holistically, the system is one and done, right? There's one way to do it, one right way. This is my education, and it stops there. And I'm saying the system and not like individual providers, because there are providers that may watch this and say like, well, that's not how I treat folks, or that's not the way that I do things. But
Overall, yeah.
overall, it's a system failure, and I don't think that it's necessarily like patients or certain communities' fault if they don't have access to what they need to make the right or to make decisions that feel good within their bodies, right? I think when we're talking about HIV or we're talking about treatment options, oftentimes even something as simple as like going to the doctor and getting BV, or getting BV medications, there may be two or three options that a provider can prescribe, and they only prescribe one option, right? But let's say the jail may work better for people. Well, if somebody doesn't know the jail is available, how are they supposed to ask for it? So I think the education system, and not like formal education, but also like community education, needs to do a better job of informing people of what their options are. And then when folks are in a situation where they have to go get an HIV test, or they're trying to figure out what HIV treatment is best for them, that they already have some background knowledge. Where folks are walking into systems without the background knowledge that they need. So it's hard for me to be like, well, their perception is off, or they're just making assumptions, because at this point they're going off of what they've been told, and they're doing the best that they can.
Yes. So in order to advocate for themselves in those situations, having that education within communities and also the healthcare system and I guess healthcare providers to present all the options so that people can exhibit that autonomy. And then I guess the community education comes in with the reality of the healthcare system of how do I advocate for myself? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. But I as an advocate and as someone who works in healthcare, right? So like right now I work in the ER as a
Mhm.
tech. I think what I've learned the most is to not make assumptions about what someone knows.
Did it?
Um, and either to let them tell me what they know, or ask more questions to figure out what they know, and then go from there and filling in the gaps.
Mhm.
Um, and then once I fill in the gaps, then go back and ask them like, what makes sense to you? What feels good to you? What's the best case scenario? And then tell them what I'm able to do, or, let the provider know like, hey, they're looking for this. Can we like meet them in the middle? Or if that's not an option, then can you figure out what other options that are available? Um, but yeah, it's hard for me to be like, well, like we know that the lack of resources and education is there. I can't place blame on the community for that.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and also communities get information from other community members, right? So if somebody else in the community is misinformed, then that information just spreads. So it's a matter of what's the best way to work with communities to get them accurate information and an opportunity to thrive and practice bodily autonomy and choice.
What are in terms of your as a community educator, what have you found to be most effective in getting people to listen and reaching communities so that they can, as you said, thrive and uh, have bodily autonomy and
I think as a community educator, regardless if somebody listen or not, is like half the battle. I think it's just getting the information out there, right? And what people do with that information is up to them. I'm not here to tell people how to live their lives. I'm not here saying that this is a one size fit all. Education changes, recommendations for treatment options change, and the more you know, the more you can use. I think the best thing about being a community advocate or about working alongside community is that you get to learn what the barriers are. You get to, especially as like a Black woman, like I live some of these things every single day, and I'm constantly, it's constantly being put in my face that like, wow, like I don't have access to this, or that situation didn't feel good to me. Like, what's going on? Um, Having some of those experiences has allowed for better conversations, right? For making space for those conversations and to hold space for those conversations, I think, um, is the approach that I take, is that see the issue, figure out what can we do, like what are the resources in that community, give the resources back to the community to say, hey, these are the options that you have. And then also being able to hold space for people to talk about what they experience, and how to navigate those things and how other people have navigated those things, because community members are really savvy.
and I guess one more thing I wanted to touch on that I was interested in. How did doing how did you kind of do the career shift into becoming a doula? Like what inspired that from this? Is that connected at all?
I think all of the things I've done in my life are connected in some way, shape, or form. Um, Being a doula has been one of the greatest blessings in my entire life. To walk with somebody during such a vulnerable moment has been such an honor and a pleasure, and I can't describe the feeling
Yeah.
uh, that I get from working with my families and being able to be a part of their journeys. I think, well, you got to have, sometimes folks have sex to have babies. Sometimes folks get, IVF treatment. Sometimes folks are presented with unfortunate situations and they end up with a baby. Um, and I think a part of my work as a sex educator and a part of my work as I used to do some of the best domestic violence work
Mhm.
and working managing like reproductive health clinics and HIV advocacy work. I think no matter how a baby comes into the play, there's a lot of conversations about community. There's a lot of conversations about self-advocacy, right? Especially if you're having a baby in the hospital. There's a lot of conversations about choice and or self-advocacy is like choice and autonomy, but how do you navigate a system that was not designed for you?
Mhm.
Um, and I also had the pleasure of doing a lot of like being a part of home births and births and the births where the experience is different. Uh,
Good.
so I say all of that to say that the journey, even though it looks different, in the way that I do the approach to work may look a little different outwardly, inwardly, and um, it's the same. It's all stemmed from the same passion of making sure that people know what their rights are, making sure that people understand that they can fire somebody on their health team if they're not getting what they need, making sure that folks feel good and confident on their journey, whatever that journey looks like, and the people are educated to make the decisions for their families. Um, and as it relates to HIV, like folks can be pregnant and be living with HIV. And that's a whole nother game. Like I live in East Texas and around here, it's still an assumption that if somebody's HIV positive and they're about to deliver a baby, that they have to have a C-section, which we know is not true, that they can't breastfeed, which we know is not true. Folks can have a vaginal delivery, folks can breastfeed. Um, there is a little bit more testing involved. There's a little bit more intricacies, but it's possible. So being able to advocate and present research and um, be a part of a listening ear in a community for folks has truly been like the highlight of my career, if that makes sense.
I mean, yes, that's wonderful. And just seeing the connection of the communities and then within that, advocating for the individuals in there for the better of the whole. And it's in terms of HIV positive women who are pregnant, you having that background is such a gift to them because you can be on their side and present them with that information. So that's really wonderful. Yeah. I guess lastly, I feel like you've uh, been pretty clear on this, but in terms of you talked about putting the information out there so that people can make decisions for themselves. I mean, they have to know, and only giving one option. I mean, they're just going to go with that. So in terms of just like public narrative outside of the healthcare system and individual doctors, um, what is the best way to, in your opinion, to get that information out there in a way that it will be seen by a large group of people and resonate with people? Do you have any thoughts on that or concrete steps on that specifically?
I'm not 100% sure. I think people are inundated with a lot of information from TikTok and Facebook, and Twitter, X, whatever it is, Instagram. And there's a lot of good information out there, but there's also a lot of
Disinformation, white noise. Yes.
information. Um, I think the folks that are still pushing using social media to post good information that helps, right? Getting into community centers, and working with young people, right? Young people like to share information. I remember when I was in person and I found out how my body worked, I wanted everybody to know how their body worked. Um, and and also I think people fail to realize the way the word of mouth works. And how quickly word travels. And if somebody has a good experience at like a doctor's office, or if somebody got some good information about how to have pleasurable sex, or where to get free condoms from, or where to get free Plan B from, word of mouth normally does it. Think about all the times, and word of mouth could also be on social media too. Think about the times where like we've tried restaurants because we saw somebody else post about them.
Mhm.
I think stop making the messages scary, because people, some folks like to engage in sex. Some folks don't like to engage in sex. Some folks just want to know what's the next steps. Meeting them where they are and making sure that it's accessible and coming from a place of like genuine care
Yeah.
help. And not like a fear mongering, not a shame based, not a stigma based conversation. Because even I was gonna say even last night, scrolling through Facebook, watching people like post other people HIV statuses without their permission is still like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why do we have to come, like, we don't know how that person um got to this point. And do I care? Absolutely not. But is that your story to tell? Absolutely not. So being mindful of how we're talking about HIV, being mindful of how we're talking about sex, right? Being mindful of how we're introducing um folks to touches, right? And how we talk about touches um is important. And yeah, so I think it's a combination of things that we could do to spread the word. I think the hardest part of spreading the word is getting rid of some of that, um, getting rid of some of the like misinformation, but also like unlearning some of the stigma and reframing how we're talking about HIV and how we're talking about Black women and sexuality and how we're talking about LGBTQ, young folks, old folks in general, um, and get into a place where it's saying like, hey, if this is where we're going, then this is like how we move forward as a community, and this is how we want people to be seen.
Yes, that makes sense. And I think, yeah, the fact that even just the talking about normal, healthy sex, um, it's already a struggle sometimes for it to not to be talked about with a lot of shame and fear mongering, as you said, than to talk about something like HIV that has a lot of stigma. That adds an extra layer to that. And yeah, I think that was well put of not only getting rid of the misinformation, but rethinking about the stigma and shame. I will start to wrap this up, but thank you so much for speaking with me.